And now, together with Marek, we are jumping in the final closing debate. We have two excellent guests, Jakub Grygiel, professor of politics at the Catholic University of America, and we have Ambassador Daniel Fried, former US ambassador to Poland, Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow, Europe Center at Atlantic Council. Good evening from Poland, good afternoon in Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us. If I may start with the first question, which we already asked at the beginning of the conference, since we are discussing a Polish-American relation, it's clear why America is important for us and for Poland. But why might Poland be attractive for the U.S. today? What can the U.S. gain from military, economic, and political cooperation with Poland? Gentlemen, the question is to both of you. Maybe we can start with Ambassador Fried.
Okay. So the other day I was watching a major U.S. news show, and the speaker, who had nothing to do with Poland or U.S.-Polish relations, casually mentioned that Europe's Big Four had met with the Ukrainian leadership in Kyiv: Poland, Germany, France, and the UK. Poland has emerged as a first-rank European power. And it is first rank because we are dealing with a threat from Russia, a threat which Poland not only understood early, but is known to have understood early. That's the bad news, that Poland is important because the threat to security from Russia is much greater than it has been since really the mid-1980s. Poland is a serious European power. They were right about Russia, and they are right about defense. Poland is building up its military and is way ahead of Germany in doing so. So what Poland has to offer the United States is an ally of long-standing tradition, which takes defense seriously, which is exactly what the Trump administration wants. They want European countries to take defense seriously. Poland does. So Poland is a U.S. ally, has been a good friend of the United States for a very long time. But now it is becoming a major European power and a good friend to the United States. It also, from my perspective, Poland is well positioned to, let us say, work with those parts of the Trump administration which recognize Putin's threat to Europe. And Poland has a significant degree of political capital with Trump world. The Trump administration and Trump world, those are two different things, generally likes Poland. And they like Poland regardless of Polish politics. There is a partisan relationship there between some parts of MAGA world and some parts of the Polish political spectrum. But the general confidence in Poland within the Trump administration is broader than that. At least it has been so far. So for a number of reasons, strategic, political, Poland is poised to become a major U.S. friend and ally in difficult times when we need one. I wish it weren't so damned important, right? I can't tell you how many Poles used to say to me that they only wished Poland could be Denmark. But Denmark isn't even Denmark anymore. Russia threatens us all. Anyway, that's just by way of introduction, and it's great to be on this panel.
Thank you so much. Jakub Grygiel, what do you think? Why Poland might be attractive for United States?
Well, thank you for having me here. Congratulations on the conference. I agree with everything Ambassador Fried said. And so I'm just going to rephrase it perhaps in different terms. But Poland has been, since really the late 90s, since it joined NATO in 1999, an indispensable ally for the U.S. for the reasons that Ambassador Fried mentioned. unfortunate reason, Russia is still there and will continue to be there in the foreseeable future as a threat to Europe. And Poland, because of its location on the frontier, eastern flank or Europe's eastern front line, is the crucial player in deterring future Russian offensive. So it's again, as Ambassador Fried said, it's an unfortunate reason why Poland is such a great player and great ally of the U.S. But that's the nature of international politics in Europe. I would add that it's perhaps even more important now because of the nature of U.S. foreign policy and the demands on U.S. foreign policy, as well as the nature of the Russian threat. Let me explain. I think Poland has proven, for instance, during the war, Russian war against Ukraine, to be the first responder, the first nation, really, the first state that has put a lot of assets and effort into defending Ukraine. And I think that's, by analogy, is its role on the eastern frontier, to be the first responder, not the only one, and Poland knows they cannot be alone, but it is the first country that has to respond to a potential attack by Russia on Europe. It's not going to be Germany. It's not going to be the U.S. that's going to be the first one to respond simply because of geography. And Poland has taken this role as a first responder, I think, very seriously early on. And I think it continues to do so because it's clear that its defense spending is growing and it's meant to serve exactly that role, to give Poland the assets necessary to respond immediately to a potential Russian offensive. At the same time, however, and here I think there's a continuity across time since, again, 1999, but also, it seems to me, across the political spectrum in Poland, and that's useful for the US, there's continuity in the view that Poland cannot be alone and the US is essential to this alliance. And there's no alternative for Poland to the US. And so this continuity, I think, is somewhat rare in American alliance system. There's some, obviously, Japan is one, but in Europe, there's always this temptation of seeking strategic autonomy or even security independence from the US. Poland doesn't have a strong temptation to pursue that. And so therefore it's seen in Washington as a strong ally, not just now, but in the future, as it has been in the past. And I think that builds perhaps goodwill. It builds also the desire to invest in a country like this that in some circles, in some political circles, may not be the same. This goodwill and strong interest may not be the same towards other European countries and European allies. So in that sense, I think Poland is a unique and strong player on the map for Europe, for the US.
Thank you, Jakub, so much. I see we are joined by James Carafano of Heritage Foundation. Hello, James. Good to see you. Thank you for being with us. And I will ask you the same question. Probably you haven't heard the other answers, so you have a chance to say something different. The question is, since we discussed the Polish-American relations, and it's obvious why US is important for Poland. My question is why Poland might be attractive for US today. What can the US gain from military, economic, and political cooperation with Poland? What is your view?
Thank you. This is going to be super boring because I'm sure I'm going to say exactly the same things.
You are never boring.
No. So first of all, I'd say, look, I go back and forth in whether I say Poland is the new West Germany, in an analogy to the Cold War and kind of the indispensable ally, or Poland is the new UK, going back to the special relationship and the Atlantic Bridge. And I'm not sure either actually perfectly works, but look, I'd say from a security perspective, I mean, I know a lot of people are suddenly shocked to hear that Donald Trump is not going to abandon Ukraine and he's not planning on leaving NATO. But I actually thought that none of these things are in the card. for the simple reason is the United States, or Trump is a classical realist in the sense that he develops foreign policy primarily based on what is in U.S. interests. And you have to ask yourself this question is, how is the United States better off if NATO collapses or if Russia is running Ukraine? And you quickly wind up and say, well, there is no way the United States is better off. And they go, okay, that's exactly my point. So if you actually look at the NATO frontier today, which is a great benefit to the United States because it ensures stability, not just stability in Europe from a security perspective, but as a prerequisite really for any kind of economic growth or geopolitical growth in Europe. But we're in way better shape today than we were during the Cold War. And when I was on the front lines, and Jakob was in a little cradle in his mother's arms, getting mother's milk. We have way more strategic depth. Essentially, the war started in the middle of Europe before. There's way more strategic depth. The Russians have 1,000 more miles of frontier with some very capable militaries to the north. You have right in the middle where we used to have the Fulda Gap, you have a Polish military, which is under both liberal and conservative governments, is committed to rearming. You have a Ukraine military, and people kind of miss the joke. It doesn't matter if Ukraine is in NATO or not. You cannot essentially threaten the frontier of the eastern frontier of NATO and drive by the Ukrainian army and just wave and say, "Oh, I'm on my way to Latvia. Don't worry about me." So that's a substantial obstacle, and then that is anchored in a pretty decent Romanian on the flank. What makes this entire thing work? Poland. Without Poland sitting in the middle there, kind of anchoring the Eastern Front, it's all kind of academic. And the fact that you now have had two Polish governments of completely different character commit to that level of security, and now committing to things like energy security, like bringing in nuclear reactors and building on infrastructure and other things, this makes Poland the absolute indispensable ally. Nothing works without it. I mean, okay, let's say even Germany did something where we could always find ways to get logistics to the front. We can get stuff to the front if the UK and Germany vanished or something. But what you cannot replace is this kind of cornerstone frontier defense state. So I would say that the Poland is the gift to America that just keeps on giving. You've got first of all the fastest growing economy, or one of the strongest growing economies in Europe. You've got a country that's committed to defending itself, and you've got even a government in Warsaw today, which ideologically is probably as far apart from Donald Trump as you can matter. And who doesn't care? Well, Donald Trump doesn't care, and I don't think the government in Warsaw really cares either. So this is a partnership really rooted in mutual interest. So I actually think that U.S.-Polish bilateral relations are in really, really decent shape. And there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about in terms of EU and regional politics and everything else. But I think that the Polish government and the American government under the present administrations, and even if there was a change of administration in Poland, I think it'd be different. These countries have decided that this bilateral alliance is too important to play with.
Thank you. It's great to listen to such voices. We love to be praised in Poland. So it's always a pleasure. Marek.
This is our national pastime.
Yeah.
It's pretty symbolic that two of our last speakers speak excellent Polish, Jakub and Daniel. James, you have to catch up, by the way. In order for us to hold the next conversation with you in our mother tongue.
Marek also speaks Polish very well.
I love those comparisons. James compared Poland to Germany. Daniel compared us to Denmark. And all those comparisons are tantalizing, audacious, but also pretty risky. I wouldn't like Poland to become a nation of Hamlets. For instance, I want Poland to be Poland, with growing clout, of course, on the European and on the global stage, but still Poland. Gentlemen, on one of Daniel mentioned that trip of the 4 European political leaders Chancellor Merz, Prime Minister Starmer, Prime Minister Tusk, and President Macron to Kiev. In your assessment, and this is a question for all of you, of course, in your assessment, should Europe take over the lead role now in this arduous process of achieving peace in Ukraine?
I am not a part of Trump world, but I'm going to make a qualified defense of Trump's Ukraine policy. It could work. It could work if the Trump administration works with Europe to help provide security for Ukraine, with the Europeans in the lead, right, which is something American presidents have been pushing for generations, and now we may have it under Donald Trump. And if the United States can work with the European powers to stare down Putin, who is trying to avoid a diplomatic settlement, there is a path to a not a just peace. It's not going to be just, but it could be sustainable in a way that makes Ukraine the West Germany of the 21st century. That is a divided country, but armed, serious, and willing to fight for itself. This is possible. I think that the Europeans, by virtue of their willingness to stand front and center, and I'm thinking of the British-French-led deterrence force inside Ukraine, at least the concept of it, the Europeans have now made themselves a part of the discussions in a very helpful way. And I think you're seeing the Trump administration responding. So this is a partnership because Europe has put more on the table. And this is quite apart from the question of whether Poland will contribute forces inside Ukraine. I know that Poland has expressed reluctance, and Poland has plenty of things to do for NATO's security without that. So I'm leaving that question aside. But Poland is now part of the core group of Europeans pushing for a settlement on good terms and working with the Trump administration. So this all could work. I have a feeling we will know more by the end of the week, but I'm just going to stipulate that Putin doesn't want a settlement. He wants to play about, counting on the Trump administration to side with him or abandon Ukraine. And I tend to agree with James that is less likely than many skeptics would have it. And I think Putin is in a much more vulnerable position than his supporters or the various useful idiots on right and left would have it. So I think we are there is a reasonably good possibility of a decent outcome. And it means that Europe, though, will have to stay engaged, keep working well with the Trump administration. And I think the British have shown, that all of the Europeans are showing some skill in doing that. I think the Germans have some catching up to do, but they may get there. Merz may get there. The Poles certainly are. So I realize I can be accused of naive American optimism, but there is a plausible path to strategic success in Ukraine. And Trump, if he gets the credit, fine with me. A success in Ukraine is worth a very great deal.
A telling smirk on James Carafano's face. You are in the Trump world, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I don't massively disagree with Dan. I mean, I always thought first of all, I always thought it was going to be a small deal. That whenever we got to a deal, whether de facto or on whatever, it was going to be a small deal, essentially saying we freeze the war in place and then we go from there. And I always say, is how wars end isn't what starts the next war. It's what you do after the war ends, which decides if there's a next war or not. So I still think there's always a possibility that Putin could just walk in one day and say, okay, let's have a deal. I mean, that he's held out. And of course, the Russians come in with maximalist demands, none of which have played out. He's not getting anything more than what's on the table now. He may just decide tomorrow to take that. So that's scenario one. And then scenario two, I think Dan articulated was if Trump doesn't, if if Putin doesn't take a deal, so I'm just going to fight another year and see what these guys do. There's one of two scenarios. Trump just says, "Oh, I'm taking my toys and going home. Screw you guys." Or Trump basically, says we'll continue to support Ukraine. I think we've already. I think we've already decided that the Trump is when they say we're going to pull out of the negotiations if the Russians don't do anything. It is very clear at this point they don't mean we're leaving NATO and we're abandoning Ukraine. That is already super clear, and you have to understand that there's very little risk in this for Donald Trump. He knows this is not going to World War III. He knows it's not going to result in nuclear war or wider war in Europe. He knows there are going to be no American boots on the ground. He knows that the Democrats are going to continue to support the war in the United States because they started it. He knows that he knows that the part of his party which doesn't like Ukraine, doesn't like Russia, they're not going to fight with the president over this because they have bigger fish to fry. And the rest of the Republican Party is actually fine with supporting Ukraine. And since the Europeans are carrying more of the burden anyway, there's no reason why we shouldn't do that. And whether it winds up being called lend-lease or borrow this or we'll get paid in lithium later, Trump will figure that out. So I think it's either we fight. The war either ends where it is, or we continue to fight on, and the United States continues to be a partner for the Europeans, providing the enablers and some support and everything else. But this balance that we're going to, that's kind of where we're headed. I think this is as an issue is dead and done and sealed the deal. I think the Russians actually, we'll see in the next couple of days, but I think they've kind of figured that out right now. So I think what Dan laid out's probably really kind of where we are. And it's funny. It's just like, this is absolutely the wrong time to be Trump bashing. I mean, first of all, for all their whining and screaming and gnashing of pearls and complaining, the Europeans have done exactly what Donald Trump wanted them to do. And he should be the happiest at all of what's going on. And he's bringing to the table all the things that only the Americans can do. And I'll just end on this is, when we say Europe, I think we have to be honest. Trump is not opposed to the EU. He's not for the EU. He's relatively ambivalent, but he's like, well, what do these guys do for me? And if the European Union actually came forward with something that Trump thought was valuable, I think he'd be happy to work with them. But until they do, I think he's going to kind of ignore them. So you can't look at how he deals with the EU as a measure of his willingness to engage in Europe. Because for many Europeans, when you say EU, you mean all of Europe. When you say the EU to Donald Trump, you talk about an institution that may or may not be worthless. And Europe is this big continent, which there are lots of people there that I work with and talk to.
Jakub, your take.
Well, James has started on the EU. I'm not sure we want to go there yet. I would just add, I guess, maybe 3 points on this question of Europe. How do we view Europe's role in Ukraine? I think that first, it seems to me that, at least from my perspective, the war in Ukraine and Russia is a European problem first. And if the Europeans, and I don't mean here the EU, but some Europeans, and the four that Ambassador Fried mentioned are, I think, the key ones, if the Europeans don't act and don't take a lead, then we are not going to take a lead either. And I think that seems to be the approach that Trump has taken. And I think he seems to be, and the administration seems to be quite happy with at least 4 serious European players taking the lead and going to Kiev to figure out what to do there. That's the first point. It's Europe's problem first. Second, any long-term, stable, sustainable solution in Ukraine will depend on how the Europeans behave, not how we behave. And it has a variety of reasons. I mean, geography is one, but even economics. The main source of Ukrainian economic strength is agricultural products. The Europeans will have to figure out how to deal with that. and how to help them. And that's a competition for the Europeans. So they'll have to figure out how to do trade-offs between their own agricultural strength and economic well-being and Ukrainian ones. And that it's something that the Europeans will have to decide on their own. And if they don't take a lead on that, and they don't take actually, in many cases, probably difficult decisions, we are not going to be the solution for this long-term sustainable economic wealth of Ukraine. And the third point, I think it seems to me, again, I think it's shared, I don't know if across the political spectrum, but at least in the Trump administration, it seems to me that there's very limited interest in having Europeans playing a very tiny global role. There is very little interest in having Poles again, fighting in the Middle East or wherever else we might be fighting next, deterring the Chinese in the Taiwan Straits. There's very little interest of having, and maybe a resurgent German army somewhere abroad. There's very little interest in having actually maybe even the British that far away. There is an enormous interest in having these European assets in Europe. And in particular, well, here's a ongoing war in Ukraine, and helping to resolve that, to fix it in place at least, and stop dreaming about some sort of global European role, which in some cases, I think, especially in Brussels and in some other capitals in Europe, less so presumably in Poland, it's still present. And I think here, again, an active European role on the eastern flank and in Ukraine, as opposed to having pretentious actions abroad in Asia or in the Persian Gulf or elsewhere, I think is something that the Trump administration looks with interest. Last point, I think was mentioned by Ambassador Fried, certainly by Jim. I don't think we're looking for a final long-term peace agreement. The best case scenario here is a ceasefire that reflects more or less the military balance on the ground, the front line on the ground. And the question then is, what happens afterwards? And here's where the military strength of Ukraine and the economic strength of Ukraine are absolutely key. The Europeans are key in this. And if the Europeans rely on us, on Washington, to take a lead both on the military strength and economic strength of Ukraine, I think they're mistaken. And I think there'll be because we're not going to do it, and we probably don't have the means at this point, or certainly not an interest in this administration to devote a lot of attention to that. The best case scenario is that Trump participates and helps some sort of ceasefire agreement, and then it's up to the Europeans how they play it and whether they use this to the benefit of their continent.
So I just want to add. I just want to add 2 points. One is I don't think we can presume a minimalist engagement of the U.S. in Ukraine reconstruction, particularly if there seems to be opportunity for there. We might actually see a situation where Americans are kind of elbowing Europeans aside to get involved in the reconstruction in Ukraine if they see there's real economic benefit and opportunity to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's too premature to say what is the role in Ukrainian reconstruction. The other point I wanted to make is I thought it was super interesting that the U.S. has now said, hey, if you guys want to send peacekeepers into Ukraine, hey, have that. Have a nice day. The importance of that is primarily it does actually reflect that the U.S. is not really worried about this escalating into a larger war or about Article 5 really becoming an issue. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so nonchalant about saying, yeah, send in peacekeepers, we don't care. But I do think this notion of tripwire forces is kind of passé. We started talking about tripwire forces primarily, I think, out of weakness, in that, well, you know what, we really can't defend Europe, so what we'll do is we'll populate a bunch of flags on the French line, and the Russians will be scared because if this happens, then they'll be at war with all of us. I don't think Putin does calculus that way. I think he looks at the forces on the ground, and if he thinks he can win, he'll do it, and if he doesn't, he won't. So I think the tripwire forces are really irrelevant. what really matters, particularly in the case of Ukraine, is building a Ukraine military that can defend Ukraine. That way you can't win a short war, and building a Ukraine military industrial base which can fight a long war. That I think is what's going to deter Putin. So to me, yeah, I mean, I'm fine with forward deployed NATO forces because it gives people an opportunity to train and deploy and all that and exercise with each other and everything else. But that's not really going to be whether Ukraine actually whether those forces actually bring peace. Because let's be honest, NATO is never going to feel more than a speed bump in Ukraine in terms of operational forces, and it's not going to deter. That's not going to deter the Russians.
Let me jump in here with a rare point of possible disagreement with James Carafano. First, an area of agreement. Both James and Jakub said that an agreement on Ukraine is more apt to be a partial agreement or a kind of de facto ceasefire. I think this is right. I think that's right. With respect to security for Ukraine, yes, James is right. It depends primarily on the Ukrainians and their defense military industrial base. But I don't think that the European-led deterrence force is nothing or just symbolic or just a tripwire. If it's just sending a couple of brigades and sitting in the middle of Ukraine, yeah. But I've heard more practical talk about sending serious air defense units that could be used to cover Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. That could be serious, or European air power over Ukraine. Now, I don't want to get into the military details, but I think the British-French force, if it's got a serious mission, could actually make a big difference. And secondly, I think the Americans need to do better than just have a nice day. I think the Europeans are right to ask for U.S. enablers, not boots on the ground. Trump administration won't do that. And I think the Europeans understand that. But enablers, logistics, and a kind of in extremis force if the Russians went in heavy. I think that that's a significant deal. But in any event, the Ukrainians have to be primarily responsible for the ground forces defending their country. And I think this is possible. I think this is doable. And so if I were, President Trump is going to call me up for advice. But if he did, what I would say in the Oval Office is you can have two big wins. You can be the one that pushed Russia into a long-term and sustainable settlement of the war, even if it's de facto, and you can get the Europeans to be the ones front and center on European defense. Now, Poland, we're supposed to be talking about Poland here. Poland's views about Ukraine are strategically sound, and whether or not it is part of a European force inside Ukraine is not essential. Poland, as James said earlier, is a backup for this. It is, in this case, it's the UK during World War II, right? It's the platform for the liberation of Europe or the defense of Europe. So this is doable. And we will know more whether soon, if and when the Trump administration decides to push back against the Russians. But what we're talking about is a serious consolidation of Western diplomatic, military, and economic strength to defeat Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And Poland absolutely has to be a big part of that. Poland has the knowledge of Russia, the good policy instincts, the military, and let's face it, a generation and a half of unbroken economic and political success, making it a first-tier country in Europe and an ideal U.S. partner.
So let's continue this discussion about the role of Poland. What do you see a specific role of Poland in the peace process and then in giving these security guarantees to Ukraine?
Yeah, can I start? First of all, I agree with everything Dan said. First of all, I would say I, my specific objection is to with tripwire forces, which I think are symbolic and not really terribly useful. What the long term to deter the Russia is the self-defense capability of the frontline states to defend their own territory. This is where Poland is and Ukraine are both absolutely essential. From the alliance, a lot more deep attack, because the lesson we've all learned is you want to kill all the Russian crap before it crosses into NATO territory. And deep attack, today is not in my day, deep attack, it was, the bullets would be landing somewhere kind of, west of Warsaw. Today there's almost no Russian target of military significance that wouldn't be in range of any NATO country with a deep attack asset. And as Dan pointed out, defense of infrastructure and population centers, which is absolutely important, and air defense. And so that role, I think, is certainly more than welcome. So I hate the term security guarantees, because the only security guarantee is the capacity of Ukraine to defend itself, to not be able to be taken advantage of in a short war, and to demonstrate that it can fight a long war that Russia can't win. The role of Poland is really super clear and simple. We need a Poland that can defend Poland, right? The more we can be confident that a Polish military can defend Polish territory, the more it represents a complete obstacle to the Russians. And where we really need the rest of NATO to really step up is, we need the logistical infrastructure to backstop this, that really makes it clear that not only can you not win a short war because there's a Polish Abrams tank in front of you, but you cannot win a long war because we have robust, redundant infrastructure behind us, which can come down from West Germany, can come up from the south, that we can bring forces and resources and capabilities to the front lines, and that the Russians can't interdict them. And that's one of the reasons why I've been such a big fan of the 3 Seas initiative, because I just love to see that infrastructure, not just for economic growth, but also to have military resilience in the military supply chains. So I was a huge fan of building this giant aviation hub outside of Warsaw, which I think would be great. So yeah, I mean, and this is, to me, a really important message. We have to turn this to, people think that defense spending in Europe is about being beat up by Donald Trump, and it's not. Most of the defense spending in Europe is going to go for the defense of the countries that are spending, and most of that money is actually going to be spent in Europe with Europeans. So it's kind of nonsensical. Like, you're not doing this for us. Every dollar that you spend is going to directly benefit the citizens of these countries, and they should be the biggest proponents of it. But now we've got this thing it's about whether I like Donald Trump or not, or whether I'll spend money. And that's just nuts. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump.
Jakub, Daniel, would you like to add something to this?
Well, plenty of things, but one thing is that I find it interesting that you're asking 3 Americans what Poland should do, and I don't know if if I have the appropriate role, if it's my appropriate role to actually do that. I can tell you what will be in American interest in the region, and one thing is, well, a couple of things. One is, I don't like the term security guarantees to Ukraine, because that is too close to NATO membership, which I think is not feasible for a whole set of political, military, and other reasons. I think it is going to be some sort of arrangement, which I think my sense is, even from listening to Ambassador Fried, is that everybody's trying to figure out what that arrangement will be. We're kind of not used to a multiplicity or diversity of security arrangements. We tend to think like lawyers over the past decades. It's an either or. Either it's a treaty ally or it's not. We tend to use the term that often I see is quasi-ally, which is even probably worse. It's going to be some sort of arrangement that shows that European states, or some European states, are committed to Ukraine, both militarily and economically, but they will not necessarily come to its defense in a physical sense, as in they will not send divisions or brigades to the front line to fight the Russians. As Jim said, it really depends on the Ukrainian ability to do so. So my second point is, what's the best way to do it in terms of military presence? Does it help if there's actually European troops in Ukraine? I think so. And it would help the most if it was actually not Poland, if it was other European groupings, Germans, British, Italians, if you wish, French, etc., because they're the ones that have to prove that they're committed to Ukraine. Poland doesn't seem to have the need to prove they're committed to Ukraine because it's right there. They have an interest quite clearly in an independent, sovereign, and militarily strong Ukraine. The French, the Germans, the British, less so, again, because of geography. So I would advise, I can't advise. I would like to see Polish troops to be in Poland to serve as a logistical hub and protect other areas of the frontier with Russia, which Poland has on its own. Again, there's no need for Polish troops in Ukraine, and I think they'll be creating actually some political problems, both perhaps in Ukraine and with Russia, because of just historical sort of memories and potential rhetorical claims, at least from Moscow, that Poland is back in Ukraine to regain its territory and its lost lands and orchards and villages and churches. So again, I would let Polish troops stay in Poland and encourage other Europeans to show their commitment to Ukraine.
Ambassador Fried, would you like to add something?
Don't rule out Ukrainian membership in NATO. Okay, I realize it is not likely in the near future. The Trump administration doesn't like it, but compared to the debate in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, Ukrainian membership in NATO is a lot more practical. Ukraine has defended itself with no NATO troops at all inside. Had there been US or European other NATO member air cover, the Russians would never have gotten as far as they have now. They would have been defeated in short order. I think Article 5 defense of Ukraine is practical, but it doesn't matter. Now, it's not foreseeable in the immediate future. I would just not take it off the table. As for Poland's role in a kind of deterrence force inside Ukraine, if Poland decided it wanted to be part of this, I would be pleased and I would welcome it. But that, as Jakub says correctly, that's got to be a Polish decision. And Poland has plenty of things it can do for the defense of Europe and the defense of NATO's east without joining in the French-British-led force. So either way is fine. Poland's got quite a bit to do. And just as a footnote, Jakub, look, you're right that if the Poles went into Ukraine, the Russians would make hay of it, right? Of course they would. But if Germany goes in, imagine what the Kremlin propaganda machine will do. So, worrying about the propagandistic advantage to the Russians is not a game we need to play. But I take your larger point. Sure. In a longer-term strategic sense, Poland's amassed capital, intellectual capital on Russia, is worth listening to, which is another way of saying the Poles have gotten Russia right, and they have learned how to work with the Russians and read the Russians. They're not the only ones. The Baltics have that too. But the Poles are a big European power that can do this, and they need to be in our councils on Russia at all stages. They know their business. This is an alliance that makes sense in the context of the current threat. That's a very big deal. I mean, Polish diplomacy about Belarus, about Russia, is something that we need. And Polish think tanks, Polish institutes, whether it's OSVU or Warsaw University.
Or the Freedom Institute.
Right. All of that. All of those Polish intellectual assets are important to us. As Americans go through and start thinking of where we're going to be with Russia, let's say in the aftermath of some de facto settlement on Ukraine. And the Poles can warn us, as they have in the past, maybe this time we'll listen, about the best way to approach the Russians in something that is a stable mid to long-term relationship.
Speaking of warnings, gentlemen, I believe we can all agree that President Putin's imperial appetite is insatiable. By the way, one of our panelists today, Jacek Szewira, the former national security advisor, once famously said in one of his media appearances that we have about 3 years to get ready for a potential Russian invasion. I wouldn't like to end this conversation on a gloomy note, but I need to ask you what your prediction is. Is it 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, never?
Well, you know, it's like a marathon. It doesn't matter what the other guy's doing as long as he's running behind you. So, you know, what NATO does in the next couple of years will determine what that timeline looks like. I did want to go back to the point, Dan's point about NATO, which is if we want to get Ukraine in NATO, the best way to do that is not to talk about it. Militarily, we can do all the things we need to do to create conventional deterrence on the front line of NATO without Ukraine actually physically a member of NATO. And we should focus on that in the near term and let the geopolitics catch up when they will, which will be down the road. I did want to mention one thing, which I don't know if it's been talked about before, which is this idea of moving nuclear weapons forward. I actually think this is a nothing burger of a debate. I think what we've learned is that the linkage between the strategic umbrella and conventional forces is not theater nuclear weapons, it's conventional deterrence. If you cannot win a conventional war, you don't start a nuclear one. So if you want to have peace and stability, the answer is let's move nuclear weapons forward. As somebody that was in that business like for my entire life, it actually isn't really very helpful because if you have a strong conventional deterrent, that is the best linkage to the strategic deterrent. So I think that's a distraction debate about, you know, we need more forward deployed nuclear weapons in NATO to enhance deterrence. I don't think that's right.
With respect to Russian plans, it doesn't matter what odds I give for a Russian attack on NATO territory. We need to be prepared for it and take it seriously. The first thing to do is make sure Ukraine doesn't lose. All of our problems get a little bit better if Ukraine succeeds. Our problems get a whole lot worse if Ukraine fails. So that's number one. Secondly, take seriously the defense vulnerabilities in the Baltic states. Make sure Poland has a plan for contingencies in the Suwałki Gap. And whoever wins the presidential election in Romania, work with them because if Ukraine loses, the softest target in Europe is Moldova and Romania. That only works if Ukraine loses. If Ukraine wins, Romania is a whole lot better off. But take that stuff seriously. I assume we are already working with the Balts so that the Russians do not have the chance to start something small in Narva or in eastern Latvia and start creating a sense of instability and turmoil that they can then go and exploit. Harden the targets, be prepared for this stuff, and don't let the Russians screw around in the Baltic. You know, talk to the Finns and the Swedes are deadly serious about this stuff, and I would give them full backing. So harden the targets, make it very expensive for Russia. And remember, if Russia loses in Ukraine and is seen to have lost in Ukraine, Putin's position may not be as stable as it now looks. Okay, I'm old enough to remember when the United States concluded that the Soviet Union in the early 1980s was winning the Cold War. that turned out to be wrong, not because it was necessarily inevitably wrong, but because we took steps to forestall it. And we had a spectacular success. So start planning. Remember what Ulysses S. Grant said to his staff the first time he encountered Robert E. Lee in 1864. Stop thinking about what Lee's going to do to us. Start thinking about what we're going to do to him.
That's a good point. If I can add just 3 points on this. First, as it has been said, the odds of a Russian attack are not absolute. They're relative, and they're relative to what we do or the Europeans will do. So, and so far right now, if the trends are correct and they stay, some Europeans are indeed arming, and that postpones, if you wish, or deters further Russian offensive. It doesn't get rid of the Russian desire of an imperial greatness, but it certainly postpones or deters their ability to do so. The second point, just to add, is I actually don't see much of a rosy future for Russia, whether Putin stays or not. Sooner or later, he will be gone. He's not eternal. I am not optimistic about the succession after that. So it's a marathon. It will continue. The need for the Europeans and for us to participate in the deterrent against Russia, I think, will continue after Putin and whoever comes to replace him in Moscow. And the third quick point is, one of my fears is that a ceasefire in Ukraine will generate, in particular in some European countries, the desire to return to the pre-2022 or the pre-2014 approach towards Russia, in particular in terms of the energy demand and the energy supplies that come from, or gas supplies that come from Russia. And I think that we have to be very careful in not allowing that, or and trying to prevent a return to a much more sort of benign and a benign view towards Russia. And here in particular, I think it's a problem that I see in Germany, in particular among some political parties that are of very dubious nature, and I think, the AfD in particular, that have very some pathetic views of Russia, and would like to presumably return to some, again, pre-2022 or pre-2014 relationship with Russia. I think that, in many ways, to me, that's one of the biggest risks at this point in European sort of on the European geopolitical scene.
Thank you so much, Jakub Grygiel, Daniel Fried, James Carafano, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time and for your engagement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A pleasure. Thanks for that.
We've been talking for 6 hours, and people still are with us, Marek. And I know what your thoughts are.
This is the end of our conference, but just the beginning of our global expansion.
Yes, exactly.
Our imperial appetite is also unlimited.
Yeah, I would like to stress the I would like to repeat 3 thoughts which I heard from this discussion. Jakub at the end said that the Russian potential attack depends on our activity, on us. This is very important. James said that Poland, he said as a US citizen, that Poland should first of all defend itself, that they expect Poland to defend, to be ready to, and to be able to defend Poland. And Ambassador Fried said that our main expertise, our main value, I mean, one of our values is the knowledge of Russia and knowledge of Belarus. And I think this is an important message for us, that we should bring this to Washington, D.C. and to many American cities and American institutions. And that's a challenge. We're going to do this.
And we know that through our historical experience, that alliances are always dubious, in spite of the fact that we are now in a steadfast alliance with America. But the best way to defend ourselves and to preserve our future is to arm ourselves.
Yes, and we have to do it. Marek, thank you so much for this job, 6 hours, and thank you to all our participants to be still with us. It's It's the end of, as Marek said, it's the end of the conference, but the beginning of our activity, of our global expansion, but especially US expansion. So you can expect us being in Washington, D.C. You can expect our conferences, debates, papers. We expect you to be in contact with us. We expect you to support us. This is very important since we are an independent, non-profit organization. We need your support. If you want to support us, you can go to our website, which is www.warsawfi.org, and you can do it very quickly on the website. Thank you so much for the 6 hours. Thank you for being with us. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.